Welcome to Crime Cases. Today, we're delving into one of the most mysterious cases in American criminal history, the JonBenét Ramsey case. On December 26, 1996, 6-year-old JonBenét was found dead in the basement of her home in Boulder, Colorado. Since then, the case has sparked intense controversy, countless theories, and a long list of unanswered questions. A question from a user named Marilee9455. What about the other video in which John Ramsey admits to paying the authorities? Why would he do that? Because the authorities know who killed that child. John Ramsey paid them to keep quiet. This claim reflects a deep mistrust that many in the public continue to feel about the case. But it's important to break this down carefully and critically. First, there is no verified video or official statement in which John Ramsey explicitly admits to bribing authorities. What some viewers refer to may be a misinterpreted or out-of-context clip, possibly from interviews where John talks about donating money to support police foundations or offering rewards for information. These donations were sometimes misconstrued as attempts to buy influence, especially given how poorly the investigation was handled by Boulder authorities early on. That said, it's understandable why such suspicions arose. The Boulder Police Department repeatedly mishandled evidence, delayed securing the crime scene, and failed to separate family members for questioning. These failures, paired with the Ramsey family's media-savvy legal defense and high-profile connections, led some to believe that the family had too much control over the narrative. Add to that the fact that a grand jury voted to indict both John and Patsy in 1999, but the district attorney declined to prosecute, and public distrust only deepened. However, suspicion is not proof. No credible evidence has ever surfaced to show that money changed hands to cover up the crime, nor has any law enforcement official come forward with such a claim. If bribery or payoff were involved, it would require not just silence from one or two individuals, but a wide conspiracy involving police, forensic staff, DA's office personnel, and federal authorities, all keeping the same secret for nearly 3 decades. That level of collusion, while not impossible, is highly unlikely without a single whistleblower or document ever emerging. In short, while it's valid to question why justice was never served and why the Ramseys appeared shielded, the theory that John Ramsey paid off the authorities is not supported by any verified evidence. It's a reflection of public frustration, not a confirmed fact. The real issue may lie not in corruption, but in systemic failure, deference to wealth, and a fear of prosecuting a high-profile family without ironclad evidence. Zion Williamson J7U has a question. What is DNAX? DNAX is the unofficial name investigators gave to a mystery male DNA sample found at the JonBenét Ramsey crime scene. Unlike the earlier known DNA found under JonBenét's fingernails or in her underwear, DNAX was not discovered until after the grand jury investigation ended in 1998, and its exact location has never been made public. What makes DX particularly suspicious is that it was tested at the FBI lab, not by Colorado State Lab, CBI, and when former police chief Mark Beckner was questioned under oath about it in 2001, he refused to reveal where it was found or whether the source had been identified, citing investigative privilege. That silence led many to believe DNAX may be tied to a sensitive piece of evidence, perhaps a weapon, a piece of clothing, or even a person of influence. We do know this DNAX does not match anyone in the Ramsey family, nor any known suspects like Chris Wolfe. Yet, to this day, no one has been arrested or indicted based on this DNA, and law enforcement has never explained why the discovery came so late or why it's still being kept secret. So in short, DAX is more than just a forensic detail. It's a symbol of how this case was mishandled, and it may hold the key to what really happened that night. Whether it was overlooked, suppressed, or deliberately buried, DNAX remains one of the biggest unanswered questions in the JonBenét Ramsey investigation. Follow-up question. If you were both lead detectives on this investigation, what would you do first and why? If I were the lead detective reopening the JonBenét Ramsey case today, the very first thing I would do is re-examine all the DNA evidence, especially DNAX, using the most advanced forensic technology currently available. This is not just a matter of revisiting old files, it's about applying tools that simply didn't exist in 1996 or even in 2000. The DNA sample, which was discovered after the grand jury ended in 1998, and whose location has never been publicly disclosed, remains one of the most suspicious and potentially revealing pieces of evidence in the entire case. Despite being confirmed as male DNA that does not match any family member, no one has ever been charged or identified from it. With modern tools like probabilistic genotyping, familial DNA matching, and public genealogy databases such as GEDmatch, it is now possible to track distant relatives of the contributor and begin narrowing down possible sources, much like how the Golden State Killer was identified after decades. In parallel, I would subject the 2.5-page ransom note to advanced linguistic and authorship analysis. The note is bizarrely long, emotionally manipulative, and contains references to action movies, a clear indicator that it was staged. While past handwriting analysis was inconclusive, modern linguistic forensics and stylometric analysis powered by AI can compare the structure, phrasing, and language patterns to known writing samples with far more precision. This could provide insight into whether the author was trying to imitate a foreign voice or deliberately plant pop culture references to mislead investigators. Third, I would commission a full digital 3D reconstruction of the Ramsey home and crime scene, including a timeline of the night based on every known detail, light switches, door movements, estimated time to write the ransom note, and more. This would allow investigators to test scenarios in real time. Could an intruder have entered and exited unnoticed? Could someone have written the note without being heard? These reconstructions could also help highlight contradictions in past testimonies, particularly about movement, noise, or the time window in which the crime occurred. A fourth, sensitive but essential step would be to re-interview Burke Ramsey in a completely private, controlled setting. His interviews, particularly one with Dr. Phil, raised concerns not necessarily for their content, but for his emotional effect and behavioral cues. With today's understanding of trauma responses and forensic psychology, a carefully conducted interview could help determine if Burke holds suppressed knowledge or unintentionally reveals information that could shift the investigation's direction, not as a suspect, but as a key witness who may have seen more than he remembers or wants to remember. Finally, I would order a full audit of the original investigation, focusing on decisions made by the Boulder Police Department, the DA's office, and federal partners. Why was the grand jury's 1999 recommendation to indict John and Patsy Ramsey blocked? Why was the DNA sample, potentially the most critical evidence, kept hidden from public knowledge for years? Why were certain avenues of investigation shut down prematurely? Understanding the bureaucratic and political forces behind these decisions is crucial, not only to prevent repeated mistakes, but to uncover whether someone deliberately obstructed justice. In short, the very first move I would make is to follow science, without fear, favor, or interference. Starting with DNA. Because DNA doesn't forget, even when people try to make the world forget it exists. Another question from Abigail Katterberg-Klababa. If the parents were staging the ransom note, why make the number something so personal? Wouldn't that look suspicious to outsiders? Exactly. The $118,000 figure was the exact amount of John Ramsey's Christmas bonus, and its inclusion in the ransom note was one of the first details that struck investigators as highly unusual. In typical ransom cases, perpetrators demand rounded, generic sums like $100,000 or $1 million, not oddly specific amounts. That's precisely why many experts believe the note was fabricated from inside the home. Rather than being a clever misdirection, using a number so personal may actually reflect panic and poor judgment. If the note was written in haste, perhaps to cover up a domestic accident, the person behind it may have reached for whatever number came to mind first, especially under stress. In this case, John's bonus, fresh in memory, could have been used without realizing how obvious it might appear to outsiders. Moreover, the ransom note itself, reads more like a theatrical script than a genuine demand. It quotes lines from action films, like Dirty Harry and Speed, adopts military-style language, and goes on for over 2 pages, something that is unprecedented in real kidnappings. The $118,000 may have been included not to make sense, but to add realism to a story that was never meant to be scrutinized too closely, just enough to confuse police in the early hours. Ironically, as you rightly point out, it did raise red flags. Investigators immediately recognized the number as suspicious, and it became a central clue suggesting that the crime scene may have been staged. So in the end, this detail doesn't make the theory of staging less likely. It may actually reinforce it, showing how desperation often leaves behind very human, very telling mistakes. A deeply insightful question. He was 9 years old at the time. That's too young to be charged with a crime in Colorado. So why cover up a childish accident instead of rushing her to the hospital? Legally, you're absolutely correct. In Colorado, a child under the age of 10 cannot be held criminally responsible. So if JonBenét's death truly resulted from a tragic accident involving Burke, logic would suggest that the parents should have called 911 immediately. But when examining this case through a psychological and emotional lens, rather than just a legal one, a different, more human answer begins to emerge. In situations of sudden trauma, especially involving one's own children, people don't always act rationally. Panic can override everything. If JonBenet had been fatally injured in a quick, unexpected moment, say, a blow to the head that rendered her lifeless almost instantly, the Ramseys may have realized there was nothing that could be done to save her. At that point, the decision was no longer about saving a child, but about what to do next in the face of irreversible tragedy. That's when panic could have turned into fear of losing both children. JonBenet physically and Burke symbolically. The Ramseys weren't an average family. John was a high-profile businessman, the CEO of Access Graphics, and Patsy was a former beauty queen immersed in social prestige. Their identity was built on the image of the perfect family. A story involving one child accidentally killing another, even without legal consequences, would have shattered that image instantly. They may have feared CPS investigations, media frenzy, social exile, and the lifelong trauma Burke would endure from being branded as the child who killed his sister. In their minds, the stakes weren't just legal, they were existential. This could explain why they may have chosen to stage the scene, writing the ransom note, fabricating a kidnapping, and shifting the narrative entirely. It wasn't necessarily a rational, calculated crime, but rather an emotional response rooted in pride and self-preservation. The decision to cover up the truth, if this theory is correct, may have been made in the fog of trauma, not the clarity of law. In the end, it's not that they feared prosecution, it's that they may have feared loss of control, reputation, and the only child they had left. And once that first lie was told, they were trapped in it. They had to live it, protect it, and carry it for the rest of their lives, even as the world kept asking questions they could never fully answer. Excellent observation from Mamafather 1215. I'm surprised no one brought up the police recording and how Patsy thought she hung up the phone, but didn't. You hear Burke say something, and then the parents snap at him. This refers to what many investigators and analysts now call the 911 call enhancement, a haunting few seconds at the end of Patsy Ramsey's emergency call on the morning JonBenet was reported missing. When Patsy screamed for help and appeared to hang up the phone, the line actually remained open for several seconds, and during that time, the 911 dispatcher kept recording. Later, this residual audio was forensically enhanced by experts from the Secret Service and other agencies, and what they found raised even more troubling questions. According to multiple analyses, including one cited by former lead investigator James Kohler, the enhanced audio reveals 3 distinct voices: John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, and, most crucially, Burke Ramsey, who was 9 years old at the time and whom the family had repeatedly claimed was asleep throughout the entire ordeal. The lines, as interpreted by audio experts, appear to be Burke's voice. What did you find? Patsy's voice. Oh, Jesus, help me. John's voice. We're not speaking to you. Some transcriptions even include another line from Patsy, whispering anxiously. What did you do? These voices, if accurately identified, completely contradict the Ramsey family's original narrative that Burke was in bed, unaware of any crisis until hours later. Instead, this audio suggests that Burke was awake, in the room, and actively speaking with his parents just seconds after the 911 call was placed. Even more disturbing is the tone of John's alleged comment. We're not speaking to you, which some interpret as an attempt to silence or control Burke, possibly aware that they were still being recorded. This moment isn't just significant for what was said, it's significant because it may have been an unintentional glimpse into the truth, caught when the family thought they were no longer being heard. It suggests that whatever happened that night, the staging may have begun even as Patsy was on the phone with emergency dispatchers. If Burke was involved, even accidentally, then this audio implies the parents may have been trying to manage the situation and construct a story from the very beginning. The Ramseys have denied these interpretations, claiming the tape is unclear and the sounds misinterpreted. But the fact remains, multiple expert analysis concluded that Burke's voice was on that tape, and it remains one of the most compelling pieces of evidence, counting the official family timeline. In a case filled with contradictions and missing answers, those final, unintended seconds of a phone call may reveal more than any planned statement ever could. Great question from Newsleafy. Why does Shane keep avoiding talking about parts of this case? Their LightJL team is preventing them from commenting on some theories. This comment touches on a frustrating, yet very real aspect of covering the JonBenét Ramsey case: the legal minefield surrounding public commentary, especially when it involves suspicions about the Ramsey family. Shane Madej, along with Ryan Bergara on BuzzFeed Unsolved, is known for exploring conspiracy theories, paranormal stories, and high-profile crimes, often with sharp humor and bold commentary. But in the JonBenét episode, many viewers noticed something unusual: a clear hesitance to discuss certain family-related theories, particularly those involving Burke Ramsey. And there's a good reason for that. In 2016, CBS aired a documentary, The Case of JonBenét Ramsey, in which several forensic and behavioral experts suggested that Burke may have accidentally killed his sister, and that the parents staged the scene to cover it up. Burke sued CBS for $750 million, citing defamation and emotional distress. That lawsuit was eventually settled confidentially, but the message was loud and clear. Even in guilt without direct evidence can come with enormous legal consequences. Since then, many media companies, YouTube creators, podcasters, and even independent journalists have been extremely cautious when commenting on theories that directly implicate the Ramseys. Legal teams, especially for platforms with corporate backing, typically advise their hosts not to speculate publicly in ways that could be interpreted as accusatory or defamatory. So, when Shane avoids discussing parts of the case, it's likely not a matter of indifference or bias, it's a legal limitation. His team, or BuzzFeed's legal department, at the time probably flagged specific topics as off-limits, particularly theories that explicitly accuse Burke or the parents of being responsible, suggest a cover-up without court-proven evidence, reference behavioral evidence that could be misinterpreted as character assassination. This isn't unique to Shane or BuzzFeed Unsolved. Most major platforms silence or soften commentary around this case for the same reason the Ramseys, especially Burke, have shown they're willing to litigate and win. In conclusion, yes, the legal team most likely is preventing Shane from addressing certain theories. And that speaks to a broader issue. When justice is clouded by the fear of lawsuits, some truths may never get publicly examined. Not because they aren't relevant, but because they're legally untouchable. QT Piece 275 posed a chilling yet thought-provoking question. What if the guy never broke in? What if he was there the whole time? This perspective challenges the traditional dichotomy in the JonBenét Ramsey case, that the killer was either an intruder who forcibly entered the home or a member of the family. Instead, it introduces a third, deeply unsettling possibility. The killer may have already been inside the house, either hiding, invited in, or someone who had access and familiarity with the layout of the home. There are solid reasons why this theory deserves attention. First, there was no confirmed sign of forced entry into the Ramsey residence. The doors were locked. There were no broken windows or tampered locks, and even the snow outside remained undisturbed. The infamous basement window, once thought to be a possible entry point, had an intact spiderweb and no physical signs of recent use, as noted by investigator James Kolar. This casts doubt on the idea that someone broke in. So, if no one came in from the outside, then perhaps they never had to, because they were already inside. This opens up multiple scenarios. The Ramseys had hosted a large Christmas party days before the murder, with guests, neighbors, employees, and acquaintances present. It's conceivable that someone could have slipped away, hidden in the house, or even returned at night with prior knowledge of how to move around unnoticed. The Ramsey home was large and complex, with multiple floors and rooms, more than enough space for someone to remain hidden for hours. There's also the possibility that the killer wasn't a stranger, but someone the family knew and had welcomed into their home before. This would explain several peculiarities. The ransom note was written with the family's own notepad and pen. The specific amount demanded, $118,000, matching John Ramsey's bonus. The killer's familiarity with the layout, including JonBenét's bedroom and the basement. This was not the work of someone panicked or rushing. It had a methodical, theatrical quality, suggesting the perpetrator had time and confidence. And what better way to ensure both than already being inside? Ultimately, QTPS 275's question reframes the way we view this case. It suggests that the threat may not have come from outside or from within the immediate family, but from someone who stood in the shadows between both worlds. Someone who was close enough to blend in and dangerous enough to leave a permanent scar on American true crime history. Mutt asked a powerful and often repeated question in the JonBenét Ramsey case. Why would the family try to cover up a childish accident? Something Burke couldn't be charged for. On the surface, it's a logical question. In Colorado, children under the age of 10, like Burke Ramsey at the time, cannot be held criminally responsible. So if JonBenét's death was indeed the result of an accidental act by Burke, why not just call for help and explain the truth? The answer may lie not in the legal system, but in psychology, fear, and family image. At the heart of this theory is the idea that the Ramseys, in a moment of profound panic and grief, weren't thinking like rational citizens. They were thinking like parents in shock, trying to protect what remained of their family. Imagine finding one child dead and believing the other had caused it. Even if unintentional, that moment could have felt like the loss of both children, one to death, the other to lifelong shame. The Ramseys were also prominent public figures. John was a wealthy CEO. Patsy was a former beauty queen. Their lives revolved around reputation, image, and social standing. A tragic family accident wouldn't just destroy their emotional world. It could destroy everything they'd built socially and professionally. To them, even a simple accident might have seemed like the start of scandal, investigations, and judgment that would follow Burke forever. Additionally, reports from law enforcement sources like James Kolar have indicated that Burke had a history of behavioral issues, including once hitting JonBenét with a golf club. Whether or not this is conclusive, it could have led the Ramseys to fear that authorities might see a pattern, prompting Child Protective Services to remove Burke or subject him to psychological evaluations. To the Ramseys, that may have felt like losing him too. And most importantly, the cover-up may not have started as a full-blown plan. It might have begun with a decision not to call police immediately, followed by the idea of writing a ransom note, followed by a staged scene. Each step made the next one necessary. Once they crossed the line, there was no going back. especially under the pressure of national media and police scrutiny. So while it's true Burke couldn't legally be charged, the Ramseys may have feared something much deeper. Permanent public shame, the collapse of their family, and the psychological destruction of their only surviving child. If the theory holds, the cover-up wasn't about escaping prison. It was about escaping a future they couldn't bear to face. Foxfire 9144 posed a thoughtful forensic question. How much time had passed between JonBenét's death and when she was found? Could the spider have rebuilt the web? To answer this, we have to look at both the timeline of the crime and the nature of the spider web found at the scene, both of which play a crucial role in debates over whether an intruder could have entered through the basement window. JonBenét was last seen alive on the night of December 25, 1996, when her family returned home from a Christmas party around 9:30 p.m. She was put to bed shortly after. The following morning, around 5:30 to 6:00 a.m., Patsy Ramsey called 911, claiming JonBenét was missing and reporting the discovery of a ransom note. Her body was not discovered until approximately 1:00 p.m., when John Ramsey searched the basement and found her there. That places the estimated window between the time of death and the time she was found at roughly 8 to 15 hours. Now, regarding the spider web, this was found on the grate or frame of the basement window, a location crucial to the intruder theory. Detective Lou Smith famously argued that an intruder could have entered through this broken window, and a suitcase found directly below the window was cited as possible evidence the killer used it to climb in or out. However, crime scene photos revealed an intact, symmetrical spider web across the window area. According to investigator James Kohler and others, this web showed no signs of disruption, no broken strands, no debris, no indications that anyone had passed through. That's where the question of spider behavior arises. It's true that some spider species can rebuild webs rapidly, sometimes within just an hour or two. So, technically speaking, a web could have been rebuilt in the 8-15 hours between JonBenét's death and her discovery. However, forensic interpretation isn't just about timing, it's about condition. The spiderweb documented at the scene appeared to be fully formed, geometrically structured, and stable, which is more consistent with a web that had been in place for longer than a few hours, especially in the cold December temperatures of Boulder, Colorado. Furthermore, if someone had passed through the window or disturbed the area, particularly with a suitcase being moved, we would expect signs of disruption: fibers caught in the web, torn strands, or at the very least, some deformation. None of that was found. So while it's biologically possible that a spider could have spun a new web in that time frame, the pristine condition of the web strongly suggests it was never disturbed to begin with, meaning no one used that window as an entry or exit point during the critical hours of the crime. Therefore, this piece of evidence continues to cast serious doubt on the intruder theory and adds to the larger body of inconsistencies in the claim that someone broke into the Ramsey home that night. Abigail Katterberg Kulibaba raised a compelling question. Why make the ransom number coincide with the dad's bonus if it's a staged kidnapping? The ransom note found in the Ramsey home demanded exactly $18,000, an oddly specific figure that was not random at all. That amount happened to match John Ramsey's Christmas bonus from his company almost exactly, a fact not publicly known at the time. In real kidnappings, ransom demands typically use rounded amounts: $50,000, $100,000, or $1 million. Figures that signal urgency or negotiation value. The fact that this note asked for a non-rounded, highly specific sum made investigators question whether the ransom was truly written by a stranger. If the note had been written by a real kidnapper, two possibilities emerge. Either the perpetrator somehow knew confidential financial details about John Ramsey's compensation, which would suggest an insider or someone with access to privileged company information, or it was a coincidence, which most investigators believe is statistically unlikely. This specific number pointed not to randomness, but to intimate knowledge of the family's finances. So then, why If the note was part of a staged kidnapping, say, created by Patsy or someone else in the household to cover up an accidental death, would they include a figure so easily traced back to the father? Wouldn't that raise suspicion? The answer may lie in the psychological state of whoever wrote the note. If it was indeed a rushed cover-up, written under extreme panic, the writer may have chosen the $118,000 figure because it felt real and believable. It was a number the family had recently seen, a tangible, fresh detail in their minds. They may have assumed a specific number would make the note sound more legitimate and urgent. Ironically, that choice backfired, making it appear even more personal and staged. Former Detective James Kohler and several handwriting analysts also pointed out that the note contained phrases lifted from movies, was unusually long, over 2 pages, and was written using a pen and notepad from inside the home, all of which further support the idea that it was not written by an outsider. The inclusion of the exact bonus amount just deepens that suspicion. In short, the use of John Ramsey's exact bonus as the ransom demand doesn't support the theory of a random intruder. Instead, it suggests that the person who wrote the note either had access to extremely private financial information, or more likely, was someone within the household trying to fabricate a believable scenario and unintentionally expose their own connection to the victim. QTP's 275's question: did they check the basement after the tour? What if the guy never broke in? What if he was there the whole time? Opens the door to a deeply unsettling but highly plausible theory in the JonBenét Ramsey case that the killer may not have entered the house during the night at all, but had already been inside before the crime occurred. This scenario reframes the entire investigation by bypassing the flawed forced entry narrative and instead proposing that the intruder was a guest who never left or someone who hid within the Ramsey home in the days leading up to the murder. On December 23, 1996, 2 nights before JonBenét was found dead, the Ramseys hosted a Christmas party attended by numerous people, including friends, neighbors, fitness associates, and possibly service personnel. During this gathering, guests were reportedly given a tour of the entire house, including the basement, a part of the home not regularly visited or monitored by the family. The basement, described as cluttered and dimly lit, featured hidden areas and storage rooms, including the exact windowless storage space where JonBenét's body would later be discovered. This detail raises the chilling possibility that no one thoroughly checked the basement after the party, leaving time and space for someone, perhaps even a stranger or an acquaintance, to hide within the home undetected. The theory suggests that the intruder may have remained concealed in the basement, waiting for an opportunity to act, and then struck in the early hours of December 26. If true, this theory would explain how the killer had access to personal items inside the home, such as the notepad and Sharpie used to write the ransom note, and why there was no evidence of forced entry at any point in the investigation. Supporting this theory are critical observations. There were no footprints in the snow outside the house that night, no disturbed doorways or broken windows, and the basement window, long speculated to be the point of entry, was found with an intact spiderweb, undisturbed dust, and no signs of recent human movement. The presence of a suitcase beneath that window could have been part of staging or simply coincidental, but nothing directly supports that someone used the window to enter or exit. If the killer never left, those inconsistencies cease to matter. Instead, the theory posits that the perpetrator remained hidden behind basement furniture or inside a storage closet for over 24 hours. Used the knowledge of the house's layout from the Christmas party tour to navigate in the dark. Waited until the family was asleep or distracted. Wrote the ransom note using the Ramseys' own materials inside the home without fear of being discovered. Possibly escaped undetected during the early morning chaos, either before or after law enforcement arrived, perhaps even blending in with the confusion of first responders. This idea aligns with many troubling details of the case: the lack of outside evidence, the highly personalized ransom note, and the eerie familiarity the killer seemed to have with the family's routines and environment. In a house as large and compartmentalized as the Ramseys, and during a busy holiday season with guests and distractions, the possibility that someone was hiding in plain sight is not just unnerving, it is realistic. In conclusion, this theory removes the need to explain away the absence of forced entry and instead highlights a terrifying possibility that the danger was already inside, and no one ever noticed until it was far too late. This interpretation shifts the focus away from a traditional break-in and toward a far more insidious possibility. The killer was someone with premeditated intent, who exploited the Ramseys' hospitality, their routines, and the physical layout of the house. It explains how the ransom note could contain such personal details, like the exact amount of John Ramsey's bonus, and why the killer confident enough to spend time writing a 2-page letter without fear of interruption. It also fits with the eerie calmness of the crime scene. No shattered glass, no rummaging, no chaos, only the hidden, deliberate act of violence carried out in the deepest part of the home. If this person had indeed scoped out the house during the party or slipped in unnoticed, then every assumption about when and how the killer entered and who had the means to commit the crime must be reconsidered. This theory doesn't just offer an alternative timeline, it challenges the entire framework of the investigation, suggesting that the truth may have always been closer than anyone imagined, quietly lurking in the shadows of a home too trusting and too distracted to see the danger already inside. Newsleafy raises a question that, why does Shane avoid parts of this case? Is their legal team preventing them from talking about Burke? This isn't just speculation. It taps into a larger, ongoing tension surrounding public discussion of the JonBenét Ramsey case, especially when it comes to Burke Ramsey. Burke, who was 9 years old at the time of the murder, has remained a central and controversial figure in many theories. But despite years of public interest and media scrutiny, few creators, journalists, or platforms directly accuse him of wrongdoing. Why? The short answer is legal risk. In 2016, Burke Ramsey filed 3 defamation lawsuits totaling $750 million, targeting CBS, forensic pathologist Dr. Werner Spitz, and several production companies following the airing of the case of JonBenét Ramsey. That docuseries suggested, though never definitively stated, that Burke may have accidentally killed his sister and that the parents staged a cover-up. Burke's legal team responded forcefully, arguing that the accusations were not only false, but had deeply damaged his reputation. Since then, media outlets and creators, including Shane Maidage and Ryan Bergara, have approached the topic with extreme caution. Even if Shane and the BuzzFeed Unsolved team suspect or believe in a certain theory, they are limited by legal liability, especially on platforms with millions of views. Creators must be careful not to cross the line from presenting a theory to implying guilt, particularly in cases involving individuals who are still alive and legally protected from defamation. So when Shane seems to avoid discussing Burke directly, it's not just about sensitivity or journalistic integrity. It's likely a strategic legal decision to protect the creators and their platform from a potentially catastrophic lawsuit. In a case as murky and as litigious as JonBenét's, caution is survival. Let's dive into a chilling hypothesis that raises haunting questions about whether a child could unknowingly become the center of a tragic mystery. Our first question takes us into a dark perspective. Could JonBenét have caused her own death, with what followed being a desperate attempt to conceal the truth? I believe that Burke is the killer of JonBenét, and his parents helped him to cover the murder to avoid punishment. Here's my evidence. JonBenét had been found, upon an autopsy, to have undigested pineapple in her system, despite the fact that the Ramseys did not recall serving JonBenét the fruit. A bowl of pineapple with a spoon in it was found on the kitchen table beside a tall glass. Upon further inspection, the bowl of pineapple had the fingerprints of Patsy and Burke Ramsey on it, and the glass had Burke's fingerprints. Burke had a violent past with his sister and had often gotten into fights with her. I believe that Burke was eating said pineapple on the night of the murder. JonBenét then stole some from the bowl. Burke got angry and in turn hit her over the head with a flashlight. This action coincided with the bludgeoning. Burke then sought out his mother, who wrote the note. Hence the ransom being so close to the father's bonus. And the fact that the evidence shows it was written in the house. I think then John had strangled JonBenét to make the murder seem orchestrated by a kidnapper and moved her into the basement. Burke also showed weird behavior in this interview. Note the smiling and fake laughter. A blatant brush off of the theory. The type of behavior I don't think a brother would have during an interview about his supposedly murdered sister. This is just my idea, but it could all be wrong. Great question. And this detail is one of the most hotly debated in the entire investigation. The presence of undigested pineapple in JonBenét's stomach is a critical detail in understanding her final hours. Medical examiners determined that the pineapple was consumed roughly 1 to 2 hours before her death. However, both John and Patsy Ramsey stated that they had not served JonBenét any pineapple that night. Despite this, investigators found a bowl of pineapple with a spoon and a tall glass on the kitchen table. Forensic analysis showed that the bowl contained fingerprints from both Patsy and Burke Ramsey, and the glass had Burke's fingerprints. These findings suggest that Burke had likely been eating the pineapple, and JonBenét may have eaten some shortly before her death. This detail challenges the family's timeline and adds weight to theories that the events leading to her death may have occurred within the household and before bedtime, not as part of a break-in or abduction during the night. The fact that the pineapple was still undigested confirms that JonBenét was alive when she ate it, which directly contradicts the family's claim that she went to bed and stayed asleep after returning home that evening. Additionally, the fingerprints of Burke and Patsy Ramsey on the bowl indicate that both had handled it, likely that same night. This detail aligns with the theory that JonBenét may have come into the kitchen while Burke was eating and taken a piece of the fruit, leading to a possible confrontation. While this doesn't prove intent or guilt, it does suggest that key moments before her death took place inside the home, and not while she was asleep, as initially claimed. Despite the strong implications, there are still notable gaps and uncertainties surrounding this piece of evidence. Most importantly, no fingerprints from JonBenét were found on the bowl, which raises questions. If she had taken the pineapple herself or eaten directly from the bowl with a spoon, it would be reasonable to expect her prints to be present. Their absence complicates the assumption that she physically handled the bowl that night. Moreover, while Burke and Patsy's fingerprints were identified, forensic analysis cannot determine when they touched the bowl. It's entirely possible that the bowl was used earlier, even days before, and simply left on the table. Without a way to establish the exact timing, this piece of evidence remains suggestive, but far from conclusive. A reasonable counterpoint is that JonBenét may have eaten the pineapple without directly touching the bowl, perhaps taking a piece by hand from someone else, or being fed. This would explain the absence of her fingerprints on the bowl or spoon, without ruling out that she did, in fact, eat the fruit. Additionally, fingerprints cannot indicate when an object was touched. While Burke and Patsy's prints were on the bowl, that doesn't prove they interacted with it on the night of the murder. The bowl could have been used earlier and remained on the table, untouched. Without time-stamped physical evidence, this detail, though intriguing, remains circumstantial and open to interpretation. The theory of the Maglite flashlight found on the kitchen counter. Investigators noted that it had no identifiable fingerprints, suggesting it may have been wiped clean. This absence of prints is unusual for an everyday household item and immediately raised suspicion. More importantly, a fracture on JonBenét's was found to be consistent in size and shape with a Maglite flashlight, specifically one similar to the one discovered in the home. The impact was so severe that it likely rendered her unconscious, or even clinically dead almost instantly. Yet notably, there was no external bleeding, indicating the blow may have been unexpected and silent. Based on these details, the theory suggests that JonBenét may have taken a piece of pineapple, upsetting Burke, who was already known to have a short temper. In a moment of anger, he could have grabbed the flashlight and struck her, not intending to kill, but causing catastrophic injury nonetheless. While the theory is circumstantial, the physical alignment between the flashlight and the wound gives it a degree of plausibility, especially when considered alongside the unresolved issue of the cleaned flashlight. Another detail that raises suspicion is the family's denial of having used the Maglite flashlight on the night of the murder. No one, not John, not Patsy, not Burke, claimed to have touched it that evening, yet it was found prominently on the kitchen counter. This omission is concerning, especially when paired with the fact that the flashlight had been wiped completely clean, showing no usable fingerprints at all. Furthermore, the head wound on JonBenét matched the dimensions of a Maglite flashlight, strengthening the theory that it may have been the weapon used in the fatal blow. The blunt force trauma was consistent with the kind of injury such an object could cause, a silent strike, powerful enough to fracture, but without leaving external bleeding. However, there are still significant gaps in this theory. No direct evidence links Burke, or anyone else, to holding or using the flashlight, which weakens the argument that it was used in the actual attack. From a critical standpoint, it's also possible that someone else used a similar-sized object, and the match in shape is only coincidental. And while the flashlight being clean is unusual, it doesn't necessarily indicate wrongdoing. Many households routinely wipe down items, especially if they're kept in common areas like the kitchen. In the end, while the Maglite remains one of the most debated pieces of potential evidence, it still lacks the forensic backing needed to confirm it as the murder weapon or to tie it definitively to Burke or anyone else in the household. The ransom note is one of the most perplexing elements in the JonBenét Ramsey case. It was a 2.5-page handwritten letter found on the staircase inside the Ramsey home, written on notepad paper from the family's house and using their own pen. The note demanded exactly $118,000, which was the precise amount of John Ramsey's Christmas bonus. An oddly specific and personal figure that raised immediate red flags. This led to the theory that Patsy Ramsey may have written the note herself to stage a kidnapping after an internal incident, attempting to deflect suspicion away from the family. It's also worth noting that no intruder would logically stay behind in the victim's home long enough to calmly write a lengthy letter, with no sign of urgency, especially not in a household where multiple people were asleep upstairs. However, the theory is not without uncertainties. Despite multiple handing analyses, no expert could conclusively prove that Patsy authored the letter. Although some found similarities, others ruled her out. Additionally, no foreign DNA or fingerprints were found on the paper, making it difficult to trace the note to anyone outside the family or within it. There's also room for counterarguments. Someone outside the household might have known about the bonus through casual conversations, company gossip, or leaked information. And while rare, there have been cases where intruders lingered in a home for extended periods without detection, especially if they were familiar with the family or layout. In short, the ransom note remains one of the most incriminating and mysterious clues, compelling but still lacking definitive proof to fully support the theory that it was fabricated from within. Burke Ramsey's televised interview in 2016, 20 years after his sister's death, drew widespread attention, not just for what he said, but how he said it. Throughout the conversation, viewers noted his inappropriate smiling, lack of visible emotion, and unusual body language when discussing the night JonBenét died. To some, his demeanor came off as detached or even evasive. This behavior has fueled the theory that Burke may be hiding something, whether it be direct involvement or suppressed guilt. Supporters of this view argue that his emotional disconnect and nervous laughter are signs of a deeper internal conflict or trauma tied to the events of that night. However, human responses to grief and trauma vary widely, especially over long periods. Burke was just 9 years old when the incident occurred, and he had spent his entire life under suspicion and public scrutiny. It's possible that what appeared to be coldness or deceit was actually a defensive coping mechanism, a way of emotionally shielding himself during a highly stressful, televised setting. Psychologists have noted that nervous smiling is a common reaction to anxiety and may even stem from mild PTSD. In that light, Burke's behavior may not reflect guilt, but the lasting psychological impact of growing up at the center of one of America's most infamous, unsolved cases. Crucially, despite years of speculation, no physical evidence has ever directly linked Burke to the crime. His behavior, while undeniably unusual, remains circumstantial and open to interpretation, more reflective of long-term psychological strain than of clear culpability. Theories suggest that after Burke accidentally killed his sister, Patsy and John Ramsey may have staged a kidnapping to protect their son. According to this theory, Patsy wrote the ransom note, while John helped move the body to the basement and used a makeshift nylon cord to simulate a planned murder by an outside intruder. Supporters of this theory point to the complexity of the crime scene. A 2-page ransom letter written on family stationery, the deliberate placement of JonBenét's body in a little-used basement room, and the sophisticated ligature around her neck. These elements appear too carefully constructed to match a chaotic, opportunistic break-in. Furthermore, there was no sign of forced entry, and all evidence points to the events occurring inside the home. However, this theory also raises questions. The level of calculated decision-making required, writing a detailed note, staging the scene, all while presumably panicking over a child's death, seems unusually cold and composed for grieving parents. Additionally, there was no DNA from John or Burke found on the cord or the handle used to tighten it, which would be expected if they had constructed the device. Critically, there's no direct proof that John strangled JonBenét or that Patsy deliberately staged the crime scene. While some argue that a stranger would not have had time to create such an elaborate setup, it's also possible that an intruder familiar with the home, such as a family acquaintance, entered through the basement or another point of access and carried out the crime in secrecy. In the absence of definitive evidence, this theory remains speculative, detailed and plausible in some respects, but ultimately lacking the forensic confirmation needed to prove involvement by either parent. So, does this theory hold weight? In many ways, yes, but only to a point. The theory that Burke may have accidentally killed JonBenét, and that Patsy and John staged a kidnapping to protect him, has strong internal logic. It ties together several details: the undigested pineapple, the Maglite flashlight, the oddly specific ransom note, and the lack of forced entry. Each element fits into a narrative that feels coherent and plausible. However, what the theory gains in logic, it lacks in hard evidence. There is no direct forensic link, no fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitnesses that proves Burke delivered the fatal blow, or that his parents covered it up. For a criminal case to move forward, speculation and circumstantial patterns are not enough, and this brings us to several unresolved questions that continue to cloud the case. Why did the district attorney never file charges? Even though a grand jury in 1999 voted to indict both Patsy and John Ramsey for abuse resulting in death and for obstructing the investigation. Why did the DNA found on JonBenét's clothing not match any member of the Ramsey family, nor anyone in the law enforcement databases? And why is it still, to this day, unidentified? Was the compromised crime scene, with friends and family walking through the house before police secured it, the result of deliberate obstruction or simply sheer incompetence on the part of the Boulder Police Department? These questions leave just enough doubt to prevent the case from reaching legal closure. While the theory of a family cover-up remains one of the most widely discussed and reasonable possibilities, it continues to live in a gray area, convincing to many, but legally unproven. That leads us to a question that has troubled many observers for decades. If this theory makes sense, then why didn't the district attorney move forward with charges, especially when a grand jury voted to indict Patsy and John Ramsey back in 1999? The lack of prosecution has left a vacuum, one that's been filled with speculation. And here's where it gets even more intriguing. Some viewers have suggested another possibility. I would bet that it was someone close to them who never got to be classified as a suspect, or at least someone close to her father, since the only way to know the amount of money that the father earned would be A, it was the mom or dad, or B, it was someone who knew how much the guy got. Unless it was a coincidence. But it's too spot on to be only random numbers. There are also alternative theories that take this one step further, suggesting that the Ramsey family may not have acted entirely alone, but instead collaborated with someone outside the household. Some believe that a person within John Ramsey's company or close professional circle could have had access to his exact bonus amount and may have been involved, either directly or indirectly, in the crime or in the cover-up. In this view, the ransom note's oddly precise figure, $118,000, becomes a potential link between the family and someone in John's corporate environment, possibly someone who knew the financial details and had a motive, or even someone who was being protected for reasons we still don't fully understand. This raises serious questions about whether law enforcement ever thoroughly investigated individuals in John's professional life, or if the focus remained too narrowly fixed on the immediate family. If the note wasn't written by a stranger, and not entirely by the family, then maybe the truth lies somewhere in between, in a quiet collaboration between the inside and the outside. And next we have a theory. Listen to Burke's interview with Dr. Phil. He practically admits to what happened if you listen carefully. In his 2016 interview with Dr. Phil, Burke Ramsey firmly denied any involvement in his sister's death. When directly asked whether he had struck JonBenét or harmed her in any way, his response was immediate and emphatic no. Absolutely not. He then offered his own theory, suggesting that the perpetrator was likely some pedophile in the pageant audience, distancing both himself and his family from suspicion. This explanation seemed rehearsed and aimed at reinforcing the long-held belief in an intruder theory, a stance the family had maintained for years. Burke also addressed the accusations surrounding his parents and himself, stating, "Look at the evidence, or the lack thereof," and followed up with, "You won't find any evidence, 'cause that's not what happened." This phrasing is notable. It combines a firm denial with a subtle challenge to investigators and the public, urging them to focus on the absence of direct proof. However, to some observers, this choice of words feels calculated. Rather than expressing sadness, uncertainty, or even outrage, his tone came across as defensive, which, in a high-profile case involving the death of a sibling, can feel emotionally detached. Still, despite the emotional flatness or awkward delivery, nothing Burke said in the interview amounts to a confession. His statements remain consistent with his innocence, even if his demeanor has fueled ongoing skepticism. Burke Ramsey's steadfast denial of involvement in his sister's death during the 2016 Dr. Phil interview reinforced the family's long-standing claim that an intruder was responsible for JonBenét's murder. His suggestion of a pedophile from the pageant audience and his challenge to focus on the lack of evidence against the family point toward an external perpetrator, a theory that has persisted due to certain crime scene details that remain hotly debated. In crime scene photos, there was only snow in the front of the house, not in the back where the entry to the basement was located, so it's possible an intruder could have entered without leaving footprints. Police also claim the basement window was too small, but a police detective named Lou Smith proved in a video how easy it was to gain access through the basement. He even showed that in order to climb back out, all that was needed was something to step on. In crime scene photos, a suitcase was propped right underneath the open window, where the intruder would have escaped from. Lastly, the Ramseys had a Christmas party prior, where they invited many people and gave them a tour of the house. Is it possible that the killer came to the party, learned the layout of the house, like JonBenét's bedroom, grabbed some of the stationery, and went home to draft the ransom note? However, former lead investigator James Kohler, who conducted an extensive review of the case, has systematically debunked this narrative based on physical evidence and logic. First, while it's true that snow had fallen the night before, Kohler confirmed that there was still snow cover around key access points of the house. Yet, investigators found no footprints in the snow, anywhere, which casts serious doubt on the presence of an outside intruder. The basement window, often cited as a potential entry point, had in fact been broken months prior by John Ramsey himself. More importantly, the cobwebs and debris across the window and sill were undisturbed, indicating that no one had passed through it. Kohler emphasized that forensic teams found no fingerprints, fibers, or biological material around the window frame or inside the well that would suggest forced entry. As for the suitcase placed beneath the window, Kohler clarified that it belonged to John Andrew Ramsey and had been stored there for some time. It showed no signs of recent use, no smudges, no shoe prints, no pressure marks. This undermines the idea that it was used to facilitate escape. The theory that someone at the Christmas party learned the house layout and later returned is also flawed. The ransom note was written inside the house, using a notepad and pen from the Ramseys' own kitchen. A draft of the note was even found discarded in the trash, further confirming that it wasn't pre-written elsewhere. Finally, the amount demanded $118,000, exactly matching John Ramsey's bonus, was a deeply personal figure unlikely to be known by a stranger. The tone and references in the note, including quotes from action movies, led Kohler to believe it was a staged element of the crime, meant to distract and mislead. In conclusion, based on Kohler's findings, the intruder theory lacks credible physical support and falls apart under close examination, pointing instead to someone already inside the home that night.